All right, World War II to the 1960s. All right, so with the onset of World War II, there was a return to the needs of the military. World War II was gigantic and had a lot of moving parts, and so there were a lot of places for IO psychologists to play a role. One of the big things that the military was really trying to figure out was how to manage so many people, how to select people. You know, there were a lot of questions. How to decide who can fly these newfangled planes that we've got going on and these kinds of things. And so two major research centers emerged during World War II, and there's still major research centers today. The Army Research Institute and the Air Force Human Resources Lab. So those were really big contributions to the field of IO psychology that were really funded by, military motives, right? During this time, the O side of IO psych started to emerge as equal to the I side, as the military was really interested in organizational dynamics and work groups and morale. So these things were more appropriately studied on the O side of IO psych. And then during this time, private, separate from the military. So I don't mean by private like private colleges, but like separate from the military, sort of non-militaristic motives. We have all these new IO graduate training programs emerging. In addition to Carnegie Tech, we have the University of Maryland, Michigan State, George Washington University that come online during this period. The Research Center for Group Dynamics at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, also came online. So we have, some military research centers. We've got some, non-military university training programs that come online. So there's obviously a big growth in IO psychologists during this time. Now, between the 1960s and the 1980s, there are a few things happened that were notable. One was in 1970, Division 14 of APA became they inserted and organizational. So now it's called Industrial and Organizational Psychology. It doesn't change to PSYOP for another 30 years, something like that. I also wanted to tell you about the membership increase, because it went from about 756, I shouldn't say about, very specifically 756 members in 1960 to 2005 members by 1980. So giant growth in the membership between, in just 20 years. The civil rights movement had a big impact on what IO psychologists were doing, because now we have laws against biased hiring practices, biased firing practices, biased promotion practices, things like that. And so a lot of organizations were concerned about accidentally maybe running afoul of these new laws. And so they hired IO psychologists to really, especially the I side on this, in this case, to help them with developing unbiased selection procedures so that they aren't maybe accidentally implementing some kind of biased technique in selecting. And one of the things that's really good for organizations is to have documentable strategies for hiring, firing, promoting. And that way you can protect yourself from claims that you hired, fired, or promoted based on some kind of insider kind of, process. And so IO psychologists really helped organizations to develop these things. Another benefit is that it actually does make objective fairness more likely. If you have objective ways to measure things, you're much less likely to go with, well, this feels like this person's a good fit, which could be the feeling isn't based on their ability. It might be based on their appearance or their sex or something like that. And so by having fair tests, fair selection protocols or whatever, you can end up with honestly, objectively better selection, firing, promoting procedures. So it's worth the while for everybody to go through this process. Some of the hot topics during this period: job characteristics, like what factors go into these jobs. Motivation was a really hot topic during this period of time. How do we get employees to really want to do the work that they've been hired to do? attitudes. How do we help employees to have good attitudes about the workplace? So those were big important changes that happened during that 20-year period. Now, the mid-1980s to about today, what we're seeing is a pretty rapid growth in IO. I say pretty because there was a little drop in people choosing IO psychology during the late 2000s, right? Because it was like 2007, 2008, 2009. There was a downturn in the number of people who were becoming IO psychologists, the number of organizations that were using IO psychologists, but it's been an overall upward trajectory, and that was just a little blip. I thought at the time, I was like, well, I hope this isn't the beginning of, the downslide of IO psychology, where they're not really training as many people and not using as many people, but it was just a blip. And now that we can look at it in hindsight 15 years later, we can see it was definitely a blip, and we are continuing to see IO psychology grow. PsyOp membership today is 7,500 as of 2020. I searched the PsyOp website yesterday trying to find out what is the current 2025 membership level, and I can't find it on the website to save my life. And I was able to very easily find it in 2020, so I don't know what's going on with that. A lot of APA divisions lost membership in 2021 and 2022 for a number of reasons. And so it might be that PsyOp doesn't want to show that they lost membership. I can't say that they did because I can't find it, but I can say that a lot of APA divisions lost membership during that time. So maybe that's what's going on. I don't know, but I can say it got up to 7,500 by 2020. I can say that, and that's like 5,000 more members per year, at the time, than they had by 1980. So I mean, that's pretty big growth in that period of time. Now we have more than 70 doctoral programs to train PhDs in IO Psych. We have even more than that who do master's programs. We have more than 1,000 professors around the world who teach IO psychology. So it's definitely a growing and robust field. Some things that are going on in the 21st century that are important and give things for IO psychologists to work on. Global competition. Because we no longer are sort of insulated, and nobody is, no country is insulated from the others. We're all sort of, competing against each other these days. And so one of the things that IO psychologists can really help with is skills training for employees. If you have a multinational organization where you've got people in different countries that are having to work with each other, there may be cultural conflicts that can occur. And so IO psychologists can help with bridging some of those problems, recognizing them and training people. During the economic downturn of 2008, 2009, there was a lot of downsizing that was happening because of the economic downturn. One of the things that has been slow is like returning those workers back to the workplace. A lot of them have not returned to the workplace by choice. Some of them have like aged out of the workplace. And some of them are just not being hired because organizations have figured out how to downsize. The most expensive thing for any organization is the salaries. And so if you can remove salaries, you can really streamline. And so downsizing has been, we thought it might be just a blip, and that, it was a function of this great recession, and that, workers would go back to work and be sort of at the more normal levels, and they just really haven't. And some have chosen not to go back. I mean, some have chosen not really to ever enter the regular traditional workforce. And so downsizing is a thing. When you're having layoffs, one of the things that IO psychologists can do is help people who have been laid off to maximize their attractiveness to get another job. So that's something that IO psychologists oftentimes will help with. The other side is that if you are in an organization that's had a lot of layoffs, there can be, survivor's guilt that you made it through. And so there may be some like literal psychological needs in place for helping people who are feeling bad that their coworkers got fired. There's also the problem that the survivors may be overly stressed because now they're doing the work of 2 or 3 people. They've taken on a lot more responsibility, and so that can be something that they need to learn how to juggle, maybe develop some boundaries, stuff like that. Ethics. So we've had over the past 25 years several cases of bad choices in organizations, ranging from Enron to the government, making really bad choices. And so one of the things that IO psychologists have been looking at is, what were the antecedents to these bad choices? Like, what was happening that led up to someone or some group of people in this organization making such a just terrible choice? And so the purpose of that is so that if you can identify what the antecedents are, maybe you can help to prevent those same kinds of problems in other organizations that might be displaying the antecedents. So that's an important ethical thing. Diversity, of course, we have a more and more diverse workforce. I mean, 50 years ago, the proportion of males to females in the workforce was very imbalanced. Way more males in the workforce than females in the workforce. Now it's much more similar. It's not, we're going to get into this stuff later in the class, but it's not perfectly 50-50. It's still more males are in the workforce than females. But just at that level, just talking about the diversity of having both sexes in the workplace. Not to mention having racial diversity and religious diversity and age differences. People are staying in the workplace a lot later in life and things like that. And so IO psychologists can be really helpful in developing trainings and other kinds of things to help people to cope in this much more diverse scenario. Technology, again, this is one of those things that prior to the pandemic, we were already talking about. We've been talking about technology in the workplace ever since I started in IO psychology. So, like, how can we have teams that maybe are in different countries, but they have to, manage their work together because they're on a team that's working towards some goal, right? Like virtual teams. After the pandemic, everybody's become very comfortable with, Zoom and other kinds of things. But before the pandemic, one of the big discussions was, how can you have a meeting with somebody when you can't look each other in the eye during the meeting, right? Because if you look at the person's eyes on the screen, you're looking down relative to most cameras. And so it's hard to trust somebody who's not looking you in the eye. And so I think we've gotten more used to it. And in fact, I think the younger generation kind of doesn't want to be looked in the eye. So maybe it's going to be okay in the long run. But prior to the pandemic, we were very concerned about that. How can we develop screens where maybe somehow the eyes of the person who's speaking are always somehow over the camera, so that when you look them in the eye, you're actually appearing to look at the camera. But that seems to be less motivation these days. Another issue with regard to technology that actually the pandemic was really helpful in like sorting out was productivity from home. Prior to the pandemic, a lot of organizations were very, very reluctant to let their employees ever work from home because they thought, well, they're not really going to work. But what the pandemic showed us, not only did people work, most people overworked, unfortunately, during the pandemic, especially that first, 6 weeks to stay home and flatten the curve, that part, people really overly worked. And so what became actually the issue was that work-life balance. If you're working where you live and it's all happening simultaneously, how do you get any balance? So it turns out people were overly productive, not underly productive. And so one of the effects of the pandemic is that it's caused a lot of organizations to think, well, maybe we can let people have, a Friday telecommute day or, something like that, or let you go home early and then you log back in later from home to finish up what you were working on or whatever. So that people can have a little more flexible schedule. And so that's been kind of a benefit from the pandemic. It convinced organizations that productivity from home is a thing. Really unique to the way that the world is today is this flatter organizational structure. In the olden days, there'd be like a president or a CEO, and then there'd be, the vice presidents, and then there'd be like the division managers, and then there'd be the supervisors, and then there'd be all the faceless rabble who work underneath them kind of thing. Today, we have much flatter organizational structures. So you directly report there'd be maybe 5 people on the team that directly report to one person. And that person is a decision maker. There's nobody above them. Everybody's like flat. And so there's a lot more direct reporting to someone. A lot more self-management that occurs. You might be referred to as an associate rather than an employee, things like that, because organizations are trying to run a lot leaner. We don't need the the middle management as much if we can get people to manage themselves. Managing yourself is hard. So this is something that IO psychologists can help people to do better. All right. This is a good place to stop because in the next section, we're going to talk about research in IO psychology.